She had seen him every morning, hunched over a cup of coffee, his clothes tattered, his hands rough and worn. To everyone else, he was invisible, a shadow blending into the hum of the cafe. But that day, when he calmly pulled out a credit card and asked to pay for every table in the restaurant, her heart froze. What she thought she knew about him was about to shatter. Hello, my friends. I am Olivia, and this is Olivia's Love Stories. I hope you enjoy this story. I had walked past him every morning for months, a silent observer from my usual corner table by the window. There was something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, careful, that made me pause, even if only for a fleeting second. His clothes were always worn and frayed, the kind you'd expect someone to discard long ago. And yet he carried himself with a quiet dignity that didn't quite match the threadbare jacket or scuffed shoes. My life was, by contrast, neatly organized. I had a job I tolerated, a small apartment that smelled faintly of coffee and vanilla, and a carefully structured routine. But inside, I felt a gnawing emptiness, a yearning for connection that my meticulously ordered life could never satisfy. I was surrounded by people every day, yet I felt unseen, like I was living behind a pane of frosted glass. That morning, the cafe smelled richer than usual, as if the air itself had been stirred with anticipation. Steam curled from my mug and filled my lungs with a warmth that momentarily erased the chill of the November morning. I glanced toward him as he shuffled in, his presence oddly comforting in the quiet hum of clinking cups and soft chatter. He gave a small nod to the barista, a gesture so simple yet precise, and settled into the corner that I had been silently claiming as mine in my mind. He pulled out a tattered notebook and began scribbling with a pen that had clearly seen better days. Every so often, his eyes would flick up to the window, catching the morning light and reflecting a depth I couldn't place. I sipped my coffee, trying not to stare, though my curiosity burned quietly in my chest. There was something about him that didn't fit the world he seemed to occupy. I wanted to speak to him, to ask his story, but my nerves held me prisoner behind polite silence. Then, just as I was gathering the courage to stand, he closed his notebook, rose from his chair, and walked to the counter. The cafe went on with its rhythm, oblivious to the small tremor of anticipation that passed through me. I watched as he handed the barista his card and, in a voice calm and steady, requested that every single bill in the restaurant be covered. Time seemed to freeze. My fork paused mid-air, my coffee cup stopped at my lips. The barista blinked, as if she hadn't heard correctly. And then my breath caught entirely, because the name on the card, the name that belonged to a man I had only imagined as poor and invisible, was not at all what I expected. The cafe fell into an unusual silence, as if even the walls were holding their breath. The barista's hands shook slightly as she processed the transaction, and murmurs began to ripple through the few patrons scattered around the room. I sat frozen, my coffee forgotten, my mind trying to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the one who had just quietly bought out the entire restaurant. He returned to his table as if nothing extraordinary had happened. No grand announcement, no dramatic gesture, just the same calm demeanor, the same quiet dignity that had always made me pause. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but my voice seemed trapped in my throat. Instead, I watched him sit, placing his hands on the table in a way that suggested ease, confidence, and wealth. Curiosity gnawed at me so sharply, I finally found the courage to approach him. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, each step echoing in the suddenly intimate space between us. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I just have to ask, how? Why?" He looked up at me, and for the first time, I noticed the small lines at the corners of his eyes, the quiet warmth in his gaze. There was no arrogance, no smugness, just a soft, patient understanding. "Why what?" he asked, his voice calm, but carrying a strange, magnetic weight. "Why would you pay for everyone's meal?" I stammered. "Why here? Why now?" My questions tumbled out faster than I could stop them, my heart racing as if it had recognized a truth I had only sensed but never named. He leaned back, folding his hands over the table, and for a moment he simply looked at me. Then he smiled, a small, unassuming smile that somehow felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Because," he said slowly, choosing his words as if each one mattered, "some people go through life without ever feeling seen, and sometimes even the smallest gesture can make someone feel a little less invisible." I felt my chest tighten. His words were simple, almost mundane, but they carried a weight that pressed against my rib cage, making it hard to breathe. He wasn't just rich, he was kind, thoughtful, deliberate. Everything I had assumed about him, the rags, the quiet presence, the invisibility, had been a mask, a shield from the world. I I began, but the words faltered. How could I explain the wave of emotions crashing through me? Surprise, admiration, something almost like fear, but soft, tinged with awe. I had judged him in an instant, reduced him to a story I had invented in my mind, and now all of it had been upended. He glanced at the remaining patrons, some smiling awkwardly, others whispering. Then, as if reading my mind, he said, "I didn't do this to impress anyone. I didn't do it to be noticed. I did it because it felt right." I wanted to ask more, to understand him, to unravel the mystery that had suddenly become so urgent. But before I could speak again, he closed his wallet, collected his notebook, and stood. His towering presence filled the small space, but it was not intimidating. It was grounding. And just as I opened my mouth to ask one final, desperate question, he dropped a single line that made my heart nearly stop. "Would you like to join me for lunch?" I blinked, trying to process his words. "Lunch? With me?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. My mind raced. This was the same man I had silently observed for months, the one I had assumed was invisible, struggling, forgotten by the world. And yet now he was offering me companionship, attention, something I hadn't realized I had been craving so desperately. He nodded, a soft smile playing at his lips, and gestured toward the empty seat across from him. "I'd like that," he said simply. There was no pressure, no hidden agenda, just an openness that made my chest ache with both curiosity and fear. I realized in that moment how deeply I had underestimated him, how my assumptions had built a wall between us that now seemed impossibly fragile. As I slid into the chair opposite him, I tried to steady my racing thoughts. Who was he, really? And why had he chosen this cafe, this moment, to reveal a part of himself to the world? I wanted to ask the questions, to understand, but I also wanted to remain silent, letting the space between us stretch like a delicate thread, ready to snap or hold depending on the care we gave it. He ordered a simple meal, nothing extravagant, and yet the confidence with which he spoke, the ease of his movements, hinted at a life far removed from the one I had imagined. I caught glimpses of polished hands beneath the rough exterior, the way he carried himself with quiet authority, and a strange, almost painful awareness struck me. Everything I thought I knew about him was wrong. We spoke in fragments at first, cautiously circling around the obvious question, who he really was. But as the meal progressed, he shared little pieces of his life, stories of travels, of work that required patience and discretion, of a family who valued humility over showiness. The more he spoke, the more I realized that the man I had thought of as homeless, invisible, struggling, was living a life of unexpected depth, generosity, and quiet power. I couldn't help but stare at him, drinking in the details I had ignored before. The way his eyes lit up when he laughed quietly at something small, the gentle tilt of his head as he listened to me, the way his hands, though strong, moved with deliberate care. Each gesture chipped away at the assumptions I had clung to, forcing me to confront my own blindness, my own judgments. Then, as if sensing the whirlwind of thoughts inside me, he leaned forward slightly and said, "You seem surprised." His tone wasn't accusatory, just observant, calm, patient. I swallowed hard. I guess I didn't expect any of this. I assumed I assumed things about you that weren't true. My words trembled as the realization sank in. I had misjudged him entirely, reduced him to a stereotype in my mind. And yet, here he was, proving me wrong in every possible way. He smiled, but there was a softness now, a vulnerability I hadn't noticed before. Most people do, he admitted. We see what we want to see, not what is. But sometimes, if we're lucky, someone shows us the truth. And that truth can be more surprising than anything we imagine. I felt my chest tighten, the weight of anticipation mingling with awe and confusion. And just as I was about to ask him the most important question of all, what he truly wanted, what he had planned next, he stood, walked to the window, and gestured outside. My heart stuttered. The sleek black car waiting at the curb wasn't just any car. It gleamed under the morning sun, expensive, elegant, impossible to ignore. And as he opened the door for me, he said something that made my world tilt entirely on its axis. "Shall we?" I hesitated for a heartbeat, staring at the car, the street, the impossible reality before me. The man I had watched silently for months, the man I thought I knew, was not who I had imagined at all. Every assumption, every judgment I had made about him had been shattered. And yet, in that moment, the truth felt right. He extended his hand, a quiet invitation, and I placed mine in his. The warmth of his grip was grounding, steadying, as if it could anchor me in the whirlwind of shock and awe swirling inside me. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "This doesn't change who you are, or me, or us. It only gives us a chance to see each other clearly, finally." I followed him to the car, my mind racing, but my heart was curiously calm. There was no pretense in him, no grandeur or boastfulness. Just a man who had lived quietly, observing, helping, noticing things that others overlooked, and now, inexplicably, noticing me. As we drove through the streets, he told me the story I had been dying to hear. He explained how he had chosen a life of humility despite having wealth and opportunity, how he believed that true value lay in kindness, in unseen gestures, in moments that mattered to people quietly, without fanfare. And when he said he had bought the restaurant to make people feel seen, to remind them that they mattered, I felt a lump rise in my throat. You've been living a life of quiet heroism," I whispered, my voice trembling. "All this time, I thought you were struggling, and you were helping people instead." He smiled, not smugly, but gently. Sometimes the hardest things to see are right in front of us, and sometimes the smallest things, the smallest actions, can reveal the most about a person's heart. I realized then that my longing, my emptiness, had been softened not by wealth, not by grandeur, but by someone who had quietly seen the world, and me, in ways no one else had. I had judged him by appearances, but now I understood the depth, the intentionality, the warmth he had carried silently all this time. We stopped at a small cafe, not for extravagance, but for the simplicity of a shared moment. I looked at him and finally saw him. Not the man I had imagined, not the shadow in the corner, but the man who had quietly held the world together in ways I could only begin to comprehend. And in that moment, I understood something vital, that true connection isn't built on assumptions or appearances. It's built on seeing someone completely and being willing to let yourself be seen in return. He reached for my hand across the table, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I've been waiting to be seen," he said softly. "And somehow, you've found me." Tears welled in my eyes, not from shock, not from surprise, but from recognition. Recognition of something real, something profound, something worth holding on to. And as we sat there, in quiet understanding, I realized that sometimes the world gives us exactly what we need, not what we expect, not what we plan, but what we need. The man I thought I knew, the man I had misjudged, had become the person I never knew I was waiting for. And in that realization, everything changed.